This is session 1 of what I'm calling this week, the house of God. Now when we hear that term, probably most of us sort of think it's like a reverential term for the church building. But I want to explore it a little more this week. I'm going to start back in Genesis chapter 27. And here we have the story of two brothers, twin brothers, Esau and Jacob. Esau was the firstborn, and as the firstborn, he automatically had the birthright, which meant that when his father died, he would be the patriarch of the family and he would be responsible for the well-being of every member of the family. But also he had a spiritual responsibility, and that would be given to him as a blessing when his father was dying. Now in the story in chapter 27, Father Isaac is dying. Esau was an outdoors man and he was out hunting a lot, while Jacob was an indoors man. And one day Esau came in from hunting and he smelled a delicious smell of soup that Jacob was cooking. And he said to Jacob, "Oh, can I have some of that soup?" Jacob was a little bit of a schemer and he said, "Yeah, if you're willing to trade your birthright." And Esau said, "Fine." And so he had the soup and Jacob got the birthright. Later, when Isaac was very close to death and was actually blind, Jacob again tricked Isaac by pretending that he was Esau, and he got his father's blessing. Now when Esau found out, he was furious and Jacob had to run. He was heading north to his uncle and aunt right up north, but he couldn't take anything with him, and so he's alone. No possessions in the desert. And the first night he lay down to rest. The only thing he had for a pillow was a rock, and so he lay down on the rock. During the night he had a dream, and in the dream he saw a ladder coming down from heaven, and there were angels going up and down the ladder. But then on top he saw the Lord, and the Lord said this, "I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I'll give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west, to the east, to the north, and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I'm with you. I will watch over you wherever you go, and I'll bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised." Jacob woke up and he realized that he'd been in the presence of God. And he said this is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. And so he called the place Bethel, which means house of God. There he promised to be obedient to God, and he set up a pillar in memory, and the top rock was the rock on which he'd had his head. He said, "This stone that I have set up as a pillar will be the house of God." Not a building where people could worship, a place where he'd seen God initiating the connection between himself and humanity. It was a place where heaven and earth were connected, and that's depicted by the fact that the angelic beings were going up and down the ladder. It was a place where Jacob was changed. He was changed from the schemer into someone who would be obedient to God. It was a place where God affirmed the promise that he'd originally made to his grandfather Abraham. That's Jacob's grandfather. The house of God is not a building. It's a place where God is present and which changes everything. This is session 2 of the house of God. And yesterday we talked about the dream that Jacob had had, where he saw a ladder come down from heaven and knew that he was in the presence of God, and that presence changed him. The dream was given by God, and the ladder came down from heaven. Now this is contrasted to the story in Genesis 11, where people banded together to build a tower to reach heaven. And of course the tower failed. The symbolism is that human beings cannot reach heaven by their own strength or their own intellect or anything else. The connection between God is always God's initiative. And this is what separates Christian from every other form of worship. Every world religion really tries to reach God by different methods: good works, philosophy, rituals, daily number of prayers said, and that sort of thing. The truth is, we cannot reach God or attain heaven in our own strength. God is always the initiator. God initiated the release of his people from Egypt, where they were slaves. And he did this by catching the attention of Moses when Moses was going about his daily work of looking after animals. And he saw a bush that had flames but wasn't burning. Naturally, he went to see what was going on. And once God had his attention, then God said to Moses that he was giving him the assignment to go back to Egypt and to get the people free from slavery. Once they were free and travelling through the desert, they came to Mount Sinai. And here it says God called to Moses, so there, his initiative. He says, I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud, so the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you. So God's initiative, it's where he gave Moses the law. The people were able to see the fire and smoke on the mountain, and they weren't able to touch the mountain. They were told not to touch it or they would die, because the presence of God is so holy. And there they made a covenant. They agreed to obey the law which God had given to Moses, and God's agreement was that he would then be their guide and protector in all ways. This covenant was sealed in blood, as covenants were. It was then that God gave Moses very detailed instructions on building the tabernacle. Now, this tabernacle was the place where people could worship God. And it was made that it could be moved on whenever the people moved on in the desert. If they settled for a time, it would be set up right in the centre of the camp, because it was the centre of their whole being, and God was present among them. And his presence was seen by a glowing cloud, which would rest over the top of the tabernacle. That's the same cloud that led them through the desert. So there weren't people searching for God, they were people being led by God. Now, instructions for building the tabernacle were very, very detailed, and they began with getting the finest of materials to build with. There was gold and silver and all sorts of fine thread, and there was the best wood available and so on, because nothing but the best is good enough for God. The pattern was very deliberate, because God was teaching the people what was required if they were to live with a holy God. The very presence of God was in an inner part where only the whole high priest could enter, and only once a year, because it was so holy. The outer courtyard was where there was an altar for sacrifice for sin. And that would be the very first thing that a person saw when they walked in through the gates of the tabernacle. Because it was saying to them, if you want to approach a holy God, sin has to be dealt with. Also, because it was in the centre of the camp, wherever you were, you would see the smoke of that altar. And that was a reminder that whatever you're doing, any time of day, sin had to be dealt with. There was also a priestly class established, and the priests were to be intermediaries between God and the people. And the priests had more things that they had to do, including ceremonial washing, that they sacrificed for their own sin, but then they had to be washed and cleansed before they could enter the presence of God. All God's initiative, because God was showing them what it meant if they were to have communion with a holy God. Session 3 of the House of God. And we began this by seeing how Jacob had a dream, and in that dream he saw a ladder coming down from heaven, and he recognised that this was the presence of God. And so he called that place the House of God. And then we saw that God was present with his people as they walked through the desert. And it was in the tabernacle, a physical reminder of his presence. They'd also see that shining cloud, which was his presence over the tabernacle. And that was shifted with them every time they moved on. By the time they had settled in the land and become a nation, they had a king, and they had established Jerusalem as the political and religious centre. And so eventually a temple was built there. And the temple was on the same pattern as the tabernacle because it showed people what they needed to do if they were to come and worship God. This temple was built on a very high point, so they could be seen from right around the city. And I believe also that it was white marble and gold leaf, and in the shining sun you could see it for a kilometre away. Now this was made so that people would remember and see God is present amongst his people, and it was there to draw people to God. One difference from the tabernacle was that the temple had a large courtyard round the outside, which was called the courtyard or the court of the Gentiles. And non-Jewish people were allowed into this court. They couldn't go any further in, but this court was there for them. And the idea was that they would come in there, they would be drawn to the temple, not just by the magnificence of it, but by feeling the very presence of God. The Jews were supposed to be a light to the other nations, to bring God to the other nations. But by the time of Jesus, that temple seemed to be far from the house of God. At one stage, Jesus went into this court of the Gentiles, and it was full of people selling pigeons and lambs and so on for sacrifice, and exchanging the local money for temple money to pay the temple tax. And that was a necessary service to provide. However, the animal sellers were charging exorbitant prices for the animals, and the money changers were giving lousy rates. So they were just cheating the people who came to sacrifice at the temple. The very place where God should be being honoured and where worshippers should be encouraged was just a place of noise and exploitation. It's no wonder Jesus stormed through there and overturned the tables, driving the sellers out with a whip of cords. It says this: "So he made a whip of cords and drove all from the temple area, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves he said, 'Get these out of here. How dare you turn my Father's house into a market?'" It wasn't the use of the structure that Jesus was objecting to. It was the fact that in the very presence of God, people thought it was fine to exploit others. In the presence of God, we should recognise his goodness, and we should respond with obedience and love. Jacob's encounter with God in that dream changed him from a schemer to someone obedient to God. The house of God is wherever God is. Session 4 of the house of God. The house of God, the presence of God. A rock, a tabernacle, a temple. But that all changed. Jesus came to earth and he was God. He was also human, and we find it hard to get our heads around that. But Jesus was God. He was the house of God, the presence of God here among us. In the beginning of John's account, he refers to Jesus as the Word and says that the Word was with God in the beginning and the Word was God. And then in verse 14 of his first chapter, he says, "And the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us." Jesus showed that he was from God when one of the disciples asked him, "Show us the Father." And Jesus said, "How long have I been with you that you don't understand?" He said, "Anyone who's seen me has seen the Father." And then he also, in a couple of places, say, "I and the Father are one." In chapter 1 of John, verse 51, he said this, "I tell you the truth, you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." He wasn't saying to these people that they would physically see this like Jacob done, but he was reminding them of Jacob's dream, that the ladder that joined heaven and earth. And what he was really saying was, I am that ladder, I am that connection. And the fact that angels were going up and down shows a complete connection between heaven and earth in Jesus. So what about the temple with its inner sanctuary, which was to be the dwelling place of Jesus, the dwelling place of God, his presence? At the moment that Jesus died, the curtain that was curtaining off the holy area was torn from top to bottom. Now that curtain was many centimetres thick. It took 600 priests to hang it, so this was no human act. This was an act of God. That inner sanctuary was ripped open because God's presence was no longer to be associated with a place. His presence was to be in all of those who invited Jesus to live within them. So if we've invited Jesus into our lives, we are the house of God. We take the presence of God with us wherever we go. We need to reflect on that. So remember the story yesterday of how Jesus was outraged at the cheating and exploitation that was going on in the temple courts. That the people had no sense that they were in the presence of God and were being offensive to God and putting people off rather than drawing them in. The question is, do we have things going on in our lives that Jesus would want to cleanse out of us? Now this is the work of the Holy Spirit. When he comes upon us, he will begin that cleansing job, and he continues doing it. He shows us things that we need to recognise and say, yeah, that's wrong. We need to confess it, and then we are free from it. So there's a process of cleansing that goes on. He doesn't do it with a whip of cords. He does it gently, but he does it very thoroughly. He cleanses the temple, the house of God. So does our house of God draw people to God, or do we put people off? The house of God is not a church. It's we who are the house of God. So this is session 5 of the House of God. House of God is not the church building. In fact, the church is not the church building. The church is the people who have invited Jesus to be the Lord of their lives. Now the early church had no buildings. They would worship in homes, they'd worship down by the river, wherever they could. But they had a great influence on the societies in which they lived. Jesus took his closest followers to a place called Caesarea Philippi. Now this was a place full of temples. There was a huge temple to Augustus Caesar, because Augustus had claimed himself to be a god. But there was also worship of the god Pan, and he was worshipped there with very explicit sexual practices. And it was a place that no decent Jew would go to because it was such a depraved place. Jesus took his followers there, and he asked them this question: "Who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "You're the Christ, Son of the living God." Now we know that Peter blew it in a few minutes, but that's not the point. The point is here, this claiming that he was Christ, Son of the living God. And Jesus went on to say, Peter, who at this stage was called Simon, he said, "I tell you, you are Peter," which means rock. "And on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it." This is the first mention of church. The temple, the synagogue, all places of worship, they were never called church. This term applies to the church of Jesus. And the next point to note is Jesus said, "I will build my church." The church is people who've chosen to make Jesus their Lord, but initiative is from God. God calls, we respond. We need to see the importance of this. The church will not grow through having a great band or having delicious morning teas. It might attract many people, but they will not necessarily be wanting to be really followers of Jesus. We read in about the first church in Acts chapter 2. They met together to learn, have fellowship, pray together, eat together, care for one another. But the last sentence said, "And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved." Jesus built the church. It was built by people coming to believe and to follow. What Jesus meant by the rock has been taken differently over the years. And I think there are lots of illusions here. Remember the rock in the story of Jacob? The rock he set on a pillar as a reminder that this was a place where God was present. The church is built on the presence of God. The statement followed Peter's acclamation that Jesus was Son of God, and that might be the rock he's referring to, the belief that a person comes to that Jesus is God. The third inference may be the rock face that was in front of them right there and then, full of its pagan temples. Jesus referred to the gates of hell and say, "They will not prevail against my church." Now that rock face at Caesarea had a spring at the bottom, which was the main source of the River Jordan, and this was called the gates of hell. I think Jesus was saying the pagan world will have no defence against the Church of God. The church, the body of believers, are the dwelling place of God, the house of God. Ephesians 2:22. And in him you too are being built up, built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. Matthew 18:20. Where 2 or 3 come together in my name, there I am with them. So this is session 6 of the House of God. And this week we've been looking at what it means by that term, the house of God, and seeing that it's wherever God is present. Today I'm changing tack a little bit and saying, well, where's our house? Paul in Philippians 3:20 writes this, but our citizenship is in heaven. And then in 1 Peter 2:11, Peter refers to us as aliens and strangers in the world. Our true home is with God. While we're here on earth, we're here for a while before we reach our true home. So what difference does that make to our thinking? Well, I know all analogies fall down, but let's say we were born in Australia, brought up in Australia, but as an adult our company sent us overseas to work in another country for 5 years. Now we'd live there, we'd live by their laws, we'd eat their food, we'd mix with their people, but we wouldn't really invest everything in that country because it's not our home. We're not going to be living there permanently. If we see our life here as sort of transitory, our real life in heaven, then we're not going to invest everything into life in this world. So many people, I think, see that this is all there is, this is life, and yeah, okay, maybe when it's over we have a sort of a resting place to go to, but this is what it's all about. If that's how we see life, then we're going to put all our energy and investment into the things of this world. We don't give our future life any thought. To have our focus on the life ahead changes how we live here. Colossians 3:2 says, set your mind on things above, not on earthly things. Now there's a popular saying that someone is so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good. Well, some people might seem to be very heavenly minded that they're not earthly good, but really they're not being heavenly minded. If we are truly heavenly minded, then we will be really good for what's going on earth. At one stage Jesus said he only did what he saw the Father doing. He was so in touch with the Father all the time that he did whatever the Father told him to do or whatever work the Father was doing. Now that's being truly heavenly minded. When we pray the Lord's Prayer, we pray, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so we're praying the reality of heaven to be a reality here on earth. 2 Corinthians 10, it says, although we live in this world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of this world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We need to look beyond the physical world in which we live now and see that we actually belong in another realm. Our investment here is to see that the things of heaven become real here. And that way we're investing in true life, the life that lies beyond this one. If the grave is the end of our vision, then life here is never going to be very satisfying. David ended Psalm 23 with the words, "And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." I don't think he meant he was going to sit in the temple for the rest of his days. He was looking ahead to the time when he would be with God forever, when he would be in his true home.